Hello everyone. The ongoing conflict in Yemen has caused one of the worst humanitarian crises in modern history. This conflict has caused a devastating humanitarian crisis and has exaggerated the suffering of African migrants. This is Mwatana podcast, and this episode will focus on the situation of African migrants in Yemen. Thank you for joining us. African migrants have been subjected to a range of abuses and violations such as killing, maiming, arbitrary detention, torture, enforced disappearance, sexual violence, exploitation, human trafficking, and recruitment by the various parties to the conflict in Yemen, including Ansar Allah Group Houthis, the Southern Transnational Council, the internationally recognized government, coalition forces, and Saudi border guards. Smuggling and human trafficking gangs spread along the land and sea crossing line of migrants from the countries of the Horn of Africa through Yemen and up to the Yemeni-Saudi borders. In this episode of Mwatana podcast, we ask human rights defenders to record their intervention regarding the migrants. We'll start with the first intervention from distinguished colleague Diala Haidar, a researcher at Amnesty International. She will elaborate on the rights of migrants in international conventions and law, the rights of migrants to non-discrimination, their rights to be protected from exploitation, and their right to access justice.
Hello, this is Diala Haidar from Amnesty International. Thank you for joining this podcast. Migrants and refugees in countries where there is an armed conflict are protected from arbitrary detention, trafficking, arbitrary executions, and other human rights violations under international human rights law, international refugee law, and international humanitarian law. Yemen is bound by customary international law, as well as the treaties and conventions it has ratified that protect refugees and migrants from abuses and violations, including the Refugee Convention, the ICCPR, CEDAW, and the Convention Against Torture. Migrants and refugees are particularly vulnerable to deprivation of liberty because of their migration status. States, however, are prohibited from detaining migrants and refugees in their countries of origin, transit, or destination solely on the basis of their migration or residency status, or to control a state's borders. Further, all migrants and refugees have a right to seek asylum or argue their case for protection and why they cannot be returned to their countries of origin in states that they are able to arrive to. If restrictions to the rights to liberty or movement are necessary, alternative non-custodial measures should be the preferred solution and should always be considered before resorting to detention. Detention is only allowed as a last resort and in the most exceptional of cases, such as to prevent an objective risk of absconding or to verify identity. But even then, authorities must ensure that migrants' detainees centers meet international standards under the Mandela rules that guarantee the detainees access to healthcare, adequate food and water, among other rights. Authorities have an obligation to treat all detainees with respect and to prohibit torture and other forms of ill treatment. States are also bound by the principle of non-refoulement, meaning that they are prohibited from transferring anyone to a country where they would face real risks of persecution, torture, or other serious human rights violations. All migrants and refugees, including those in detention, must be afforded the right to challenge their forced removal or make asylum claims. In addition, migrants and refugees must also be protected from human trafficking. Authorities have a responsibility under international law to act with due diligence and to take effective measures to prevent and combat trafficking in persons, and to punish the traffickers and protect and assist the victims of such trafficking. Women and girls migrants are at risk of human trafficking. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which Yemen ratified, requires state parties to take all appropriate measures to suppress all forms of trafficking in women and to provide appropriate and effective remedies to women whose rights have been violated. States also have an obligation to ensure that migrants and refugees crossing borders are protected from violations to their right to life. States must abide by the relevant international principles and norms governing the use of force by law enforcement authorities, including the Code of Conduct for law enforcement officials and the basic principles on the use of force and firearms by law enforcement officials. Law enforcement officials may only use force when it is strictly necessary, and intentional lethal use of firearms may only be made when strictly unavoidable in order to protect life. When lethal force is used, it should be exercised with restraint, and medical assistance should be provided as soon as possible when necessary. States have a duty to investigate, prosecute, and punish all violations to the right to life. There must be thorough and impartial investigations of all suspected cases of extralegal, arbitrary, and summary executions against migrants and refugees crossing borders.
That was Diala Haidar, a researcher at Amnesty International. On August 2023, Human Rights Watch issued a report on the massive killing of African migrants by the Saudi border guards. On this matter, we move on to the second intervention in this episode, Nadia Hardman, from the Refugee and Migrants Rights Division at the Human Rights Watch.
Human Rights Watch has documented mass killings of Ethiopian migrants at the Yemen-Saudi border. Saudi border guards have used explosive weapons and shot people at close range in a manner which is widespread and systematic and may amount to a crime against humanity. Human Rights Watch interviewed 42 migrants and asylum seekers from Ethiopia who tried to cross the border between March 2022 and June 2023. Everyone had travelled on the not well-known eastern route from the Horn of Africa, crossing the Gulf of Aden from Djibouti, traversing Yemen, and arriving at the border with Saudi Arabia. This route is facilitated by a network of smugglers and traffickers from Ethiopia, exploiting people who are in extreme poverty or fleeing the conflict in northern Ethiopia. The eastern route is an extremely abusive route, with smugglers and traffickers abusing migrants and asylum seekers from Ethiopia, sexually assaulting them, beating them, extorting money from them, bribing. The journey is terrible all the way up to the border with Saudi Arabia. Access to the border is facilitated by Houthi forces who control northern Yemen and Sa'da, and they securitize the holding facilities where migrants and asylum seekers are kept on the border inside Yemen, and sometimes take migrants and asylum seekers to detention centers where conditions are extremely abusive also. Human Rights Watch found 2 migrant camps, informal settlements on the border with Saudi Arabia in Sa'da, one called Al-Thabit and the other called Al-Raqqa, where migrants and asylum seekers are held before attempting to cross the border. People said there were thousands of people held in these informal camps. Groups trying to cross the border were usually massive, up to 300 people. Interviewees said they were mostly women and kids. Generally, Saudi border guards fired explosive weapons directly at massive groups of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers trying to cross the border. People said they saw mortar projectiles, rocket launchers mounted on top of Saudi vehicles, and they described the attacks as like a bomb or something falling from a plane. Survivors of explosive weapons attacks described killing fields, dead and wounded migrants all across the mountainside, and recalled the guilt of not being able to help people who were wounded because they were running for their lives. One 14-year-old girl said she passed out after an explosive weapon attack and woke up to find what she thought were people sleeping around her, but they were actually dead bodies. Another survivor of an explosive weapons attack said the Saudi border guards approached him and other survivors and forced him to rape the girl survivors in his group. He said he participated in the rape when he saw another man who refused summarily executed. People traveling in smaller groups, sometimes 10 or less, were usually faced with shootings at close range by Saudi border guards. Ethiopians said that the Saudi border guards would approach them as they attempted to cross the border and would ask them what limb of their body they wanted to be shot at, and then they would be shot in that limb. Others said that when they crossed the border and they saw Saudi border guards with their rifles, They would wait until they approached the Saudi border guards or were near them, and sometimes even had conversations with them, and then would be shot at as they moved past. In many instances, survivors said after explosive weapons attacks or shootings, Saudi border guards would take them to temporary detention facilities where they were held for days or sometimes months. In one instance, a woman said she was held in a detention facility for 8 months in Dair in Saudi Arabia. When she was released, she was pushed back by the Saudi border guards to the Yemen border, but was then fired on by an explosive weapon, and she witnessed 20 people in her group instantly killed. She was hit by shrapnel in her face. These killings, documented by Human Rights Watch, represent a massive escalation from what were once occasional and infrequent killings at the border by Saudi Arabian border guards of migrants and asylum seekers, to a pattern which is widespread and systematic and could amount to a crime against humanity. We call on the Saudi authorities to immediately cease targeting migrants and asylum seekers with explosive weapons and shootings at close range at the Yemen-Saudi border. We call on the UN to establish a UN-backed mechanism to assess whether the killings do amount to a crime against humanity.
That was Nadia Hardman from the Refugee and Migrant Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Migrants who need to work in Yemen face persecution, including work without contracts and low-paid work. Some works as forced labor in exchange for food and drink. Mwatana for Human Rights documented around 105 incidents of violation against African migrants until the end of July 2023, committed by the parties to the armed conflict in Yemen. Despite the suffering of African migrants in Yemen and the magnitude of the violation they face, efforts to reduce these risks and suffering remain very lackluster and fall short of the required level, making the suffering of migrants invisible and their tragedy largely forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Mwatana Podcast. Stay tuned for the next episode.